Hello all. This video review will cover some of the material in Romans chapter 13. Glad to have you with me today, and thanks again for being with me through our study of Romans. First of all, let's talk about what Paul writes about the Christian and civil government in chapter 13 verses 1 through 7. I think I want to say first of all that there is a wide divergence on how this text should be understood, so let's acknowledge this at the outset. What do we learn about civil government in these verses? Well, first, Paul lets us know that civil governments are ordained of God. That's verse 1. In fact, Paul writes that all authority in the end is from God. Second, Paul writes that civil governments are meant to be servants of God. They are servants of God, ministers of God, for the good of the people. That's verses 4 and 6. Third, Paul writes that we, or should I say his original readers, should submit to the governing authorities, and I'll come back to that idea later. Now, why does he say that we should submit to these governmental authorities? What are his reasons? What are his motives? Well, his first one is we should submit in order to avoid the penalty that government would inflict for failure to submit. He says that rulers are a terror to bad conduct, but to those who are good and to those who show good conduct, well, they should be no fear from the government. And then he writes that the authority does not bear the sword in vain. So, to avoid the penalty of not submitting, Christians should submit. But there's a second reason that he gives, and that is, well, to have a clear conscience before God. Okay, now I want to go back to something I just said. I must tell you that I wonder if what Paul writes here has very specific application to the Christians in Rome, and perhaps may not have application in other settings and other situations. I want us to remember that this is an occasional document, the letter to the Romans, that, after all, it was written to a specific audience in the first century, and it addresses a specific situation. Now, that doesn't mean that we cannot learn from this book, of course. There are principles here, and there are passages here that have direct and clear application to all of us. But we need to recognize that this is a letter that, while not written to us, was written for us, for our learning. So the question would be, is Paul laying down principles that would apply to all Christians in all established governments in all ages, even to Christians who lived under an oppressive regime that persecuted them? Well, in fact, Nero was the emperor at the time that Paul writes this, and he was no friend to Christianity, and Christians were persecuted during his reign, weren't they? Now, it could be that Paul is writing early in Nero's reign when Christians were not so persecuted. I know that's true. What I'm saying then is, so perhaps what Paul writes here would have universal application to Christians of all times and under all governments. No matter what the government, Paul would be saying Christians need to submit. On the other hand, Paul may be writing in general terms to meet the need of the Romans and not legislating for every conceivable situation in which the Christian might find himself. For example, Paul does not address the problem of if or when it is right to rebel against unjust tyranny, or what to do when there are rival claimants to the crown, or conflicts between civil and religious authorities. He does not distinguish between legitimate and usurped authority. He does not speak of the situation in which the state asks the citizen to do something against the law of God, although, of course, we know, don't we, what he would say, because this is the statement in other passages of Scripture: we must obey God rather than man. Paul does not say what the Christian should do when the state fails to do its duty. Perhaps then Paul is not trying to cover every situation. Rather, perhaps he is telling us something of the essential nature of government, and that, at least in most situations, Christians are to be model citizens. They should submit to the laws of the government, and they should pay their taxes, giving honor to whom honor is due. Jesus said the same thing, didn't he? I remember thinking about this passage when I was a sophomore in college at Oklahoma Christian College. I think I was a sophomore when I took this course in philosophy from Dr. James O. Baird. And I wondered at the time if this scripture would have prohibited me from fighting for American independence against the English government had I been alive in the late 1700s. It's a challenging passage. Does it have specific application in Paul's day, or does it have more universal application? Well, I'm not sure. In the end, I'm not sure if Romans 13:1 through 7 should be applied universally or only for Paul's specific first century Roman audience. I do, however, believe that this text can be applied in every situation and in every age, for I believe there are principles here that would certainly apply. I'm sorry to leave you possibly scratching your head and maybe disagreeing with me on this, but I think we need to be tolerant of different opinions on this text because, as I said, there's a wide divergence on how this text should be applied. Now, let's talk a little bit about what Paul says the Christian's attitude to people in general should be in verses 8 through 10. Owe no one anything except to love one another, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. What is our obligation to people in general? Clearly, it is to love them. Christians are to be loving people, right? Paul says that all of the commandments of the old law of Moses are summed up in this word: love your neighbor as yourself. Love fulfills the law. Of course, he's only repeating what Jesus said, which was recorded in Matthew chapter 22. In sum, the Christian life is all about loving God and loving people. Simplicity is a wonderful thing, isn't it? Then I want us to take a short, brief look at what Paul writes in verse 11 and verses following. I want you to notice what he writes here. He says, it's time to wake up from your indifference and lethargy. Perhaps we need to hear this. Submit to the governing authorities. I imagine that we need to hear, love your neighbor as yourself. But I'm absolutely positive that we need to hear, wake up from your indifference and lethargy. For salvation is nearer to us now than when we became believers. The night is far gone, the day is near. Paul says a spirit of urgency is what is called for. And on that note, I'll say goodbye, and I'll see you next week. God bless.